My guest today is Alexander. He is he has a background in cognitive and behavioral neuroscience, and he is now doing research in cognitive neuroscience. And his area of special interest is sexual attractiveness, dating, and relationships, particularly between men and women, sexual and romantic relationships. And I've been following Alexander for a while on Twitter, where he goes under the handle at DatePysch. And he also has a YouTube channel and a website. I will put the links to all of those things in the show notes. And you specialize in a data-driven approach to questions that are usually answered on the basis of wishful thinking, misogyny or misandry, or basic vibes. And you usually confront myths that have myths and beliefs and general truisms about dating, and you examine those and bring the evidence from the data. So thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I'm looking forward to it.
And I'll especially thank Alexander for joining me in what is for him the middle of the night. This is what happens when you live in Australia. But yeah, I have my magnetic boots on, so I'm able to give this interview upside down, hanging off the wrong side of the planet. And it's a beautiful sunny day here. Thank you so much for joining me. So first of all, I think I'd like to let's talk about some of those erroneous beliefs about dating and men and women, and how much truth there is to them. So one of the things that I most frequently come across on Twitter, where there's a large community of men who regard themselves as kind of black-pilled, which means that they have become cynical about women in dating and romantic situations. And one of their big fixations is on how dating apps have changed the way in which people are dating, and in particular have been very disadvantageous to men. And the contention is that there is a Pareto principle going on in which most women are competing for a very small number of very attractive and tall and high-earning men, while most men are getting no matches or dates at all. So let's start there with this imbalance between men and women, and how you feel about how dating apps reflect or don't reflect that, and the different experiences the sexes on dating apps, something with which I have some personal experience also to add.
Certainly, yeah. So, yeah, there's a lot of discourse there, and dating apps have certainly kind of changed the game since they began to become popular. I think in the 2012 and onwards, and just growing. And certainly, recent research has indicated about half of couples meet online. Probably half of that online is on dating apps. So maybe about 25% of couples these days meet on these dating apps, and then outside of dating apps, of course, probably a lot of that is social media and networks and that sort of thing online. But yeah, one of the interesting things we see on dating apps is they usually have a very imbalanced sex ratio. So there's many more men to begin with than women. And that's already going to contribute to kind of that, what's been described as kind of that Pareto principle, that mismatch there. Because even if everyone just matched up 1-to-1 on the dating app, you could only have the top, if it's a 4-to-1 ratio, which is very common, you could only have, the top 25% of men or so even get a match. So already, if you have a ratio like that, it's going to be difficult. And then, yeah, we do see differences in swiping behavior. It's not the case that only, a top percent of men ever get matches, but we do see that, most matches are kind of skewed toward a top percentage of men. About half of men get matches on dating apps. And when we look at, a lot of this is focused on match rates and swipe rates. And we know that women and men use very different match and swiping strategies. Well, men use a serial swiping strategy. They'll swipe on almost anything, whereas women, on the other hand, become much more selective. And we see an effect as well that the more time people spend on apps, the more selective they become, the more they do the swipe lefts or reject. So there's a lot of
Mm,
different things going on apps to that extent. When you ask people about their experiences on apps and all of that, then you begin to see what's closer to a one-run ratio. That men and women report a similar number of sexual partners on apps, a similar number of dates from apps. If you ask about satisfaction, again, it comes down to about half of men and women say, "Yeah, I kind of like apps." About half say, "No, I don't really like apps." So it's kind of a complex picture, but people focus a lot on like the matches and the swipes, and perhaps it paints more of kind of a black pilling picture than looking at like who actually goes on dates and does it end up working out? Because you don't have to get 100 matches to meet someone on an app. You just have to get a few matches if it works out. So it's a little bit not quite as extreme, fortunately.
yeah, yeah. I mean, certainly my experience was swiping left on almost everybody. Um, I've read Tinder like this. In fact, I even swiped left on some men who I might have liked, because I had such a muscle memory of just swiping left on everyone that a couple of
Yeah,
times I accidentally swiped left. But nevertheless, and I had many matches, but the majority of those matches didn't message me or didn't reply if I messaged them. And of those who messaged, then only a small proportion actually agreed to go and ask me on dates or agreed to go on dates. And of those, only one. Um,
yeah,
well, actually, I have dated more than one man on Tinder, but I'm currently dating one man I met on Tinder. So
good.
there's a funnel
Yeah.
that uh, that goes down in that direction. How many matches you have is quite irrelevant, um, because most people are not going to amass a large number of boyfriends. You're only looking for one boyfriend. So 100 matches is kind of irrelevant. Do you feel that
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was gonna say that's a good point. I think a lot of men don't realize the experience of women on these apps. They tend to think like, okay, women can get a lot of matches, but that doesn't mean women are going to meet all of those people. It doesn't mean that those women are all going to be sharing the same person. Like you said, women are just kind of looking for one person. They'll eventually find someone and they'll kind of be taken out of the pool. But yeah,
Do you feel how much truth do you feel there is to the kind of common belief that women are um, quote unquote too choosy? So this is one of the narratives that I hear from the black pilled men all the time, that these quite ordinary women are waiting around for Brad Pitt to appear to what they call a Chad, the ultimate most attractive man. Um, and as a result, what you get is a small number of very attractive men who, in effect, have harems. And there was a famous case of this, the West Elm Caleb, that was reported in the New York Times, where about, a large number of women, like, I don't know, tens of women, um, discovered that they were all dating the same guy, who they'd met, I think, on Bumble. I can't remember,
hmm
one of the apps, whose username on the app was West Elm Caleb. And there was an article about this. How common is the West Elm Caleb phenomenon? And to what extent do you feel that women are um, pursuing a non optimal strategy and being too fussy? Do you think women are being as fussy as reputed, and do you think that is causing more loneliness?
well, as far as the West Elm Caleb, how common is this? We see a relatively close one-to-one ratio of what people report for sexual partners within the past year. So it probably isn't the case that a small amount of men are amassing most of the women. So we might see kind of this Pareto principle in matches, which makes sense on the apps, but it doesn't seem to translate into like who is actually dating or sexual behavior. And I think that's why we get kind of really salient anecdotes like West Elm Code that come out. We don't have a lot of other anecdotes perhaps that come to mind because these are kind of uncommon things. But yeah, anything can happen in a world of billions and billions of people. As far as women being too selective or that sort of thing, I mean, It's kind of a very subjective question in that sense. We know, from evolutionary psychology that women have evolved to be much more selective than men. Certainly, the burdens, parental investment theory, that kind of thing. Uh, the burdens upon women for making a bad selection are much, much higher, right? So women have to consider, like, is this someone who's going to commit to me? Is this someone who's not going to hurt me? Are they attractive? All sorts of different things. Whereas men, from the evolutionary perspective, have a much lower burden for sex, for risking sex. Even for women, risking sex is a physical burden through pregnancy and that sort of thing, in a way that it isn't for men. So yeah, we expect women to be more selective across the board. Women and men probably are not that different when it comes to selection for physical attractiveness. And we see that in research on dating apps as well, that the most
Mm.
attractive male and female profiles, they get way more attention. And the effect is actually pretty similar for men and women. So men are shooting way up on dating apps. If sometimes this is described as hypergamy. Hypergamy really is a selection up in status. But sometimes we see the word hypergamy used in the black pill, manosphere type spaces, just for like, you want an attractive mate. But like, yeah, everyone prioritizes physically attractive mates, and men and women kind of do that to the same extent. A big difference is that sometimes men only focus on physical attractiveness, where women focus on so many other things. And yeah, and that probably makes it seem like women are really, really selective. But from a practical point of view, at the end of the day, it's like, what do you want women to do? Do you want them to pick guys that they don't really like? I mean, if you're that guy, is that kind of what looks good for you? Is that like, you want to be that guy, like, I want you to settle for me, and then she doesn't really like you that much and she's not that attracted to you? I mean, there's not really a solution there. It's kind of like, women are going to be as picky as they want to be, and you can kind of cry and complain about it, but you like who you like at the end of the day.
Mm. Mm. Do you feel to what extent do you think apps have changed the situation? I'm quite surprised by the way by that statistic that only a quarter of couples met through apps. I think this is because of my age cohort. So although perhaps I do know some younger people who met in real life, everyone I know who has begun a serious relationship over the age of 40 and certainly over the age of 50 has met on an app. I don't know whether that is simply anecdotal, um, but yes, almost in that age group, almost everyone has met on an app. Apps have completely replaced meeting in real life. Um, I went to a wedding of a friend of mine about 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. He got married, and he and his wife met on Match.com, and that was kind of scandalous. And he revealed this at the wedding, or I think his best man revealed it in a speech, and his wife was not that happy about it. Um, and everyone thought this was kind of dodgy, and it implied that he or she or both of them had been desperate, and somehow had thought themselves or had been not attractive enough to find a partner in the normal way. And now that stigma seems to have completely disappeared, um, totally disappeared. And not only that, but it feels to me that everybody is meeting on apps, but maybe that's the range of people, age range of people who I know. Um,
Yeah, certainly the stigma. I remember that even myself as kind of an early adopter of apps, it was a very weird thing, and now it's the normal thing, like the totally normal thing, and it's almost more weird to meet people in person, especially I think for the youngest generation that
yeah.
are raised with these apps that spend a lot of time on social media. Some of these young men and women think that it's strange to even talk to friends and meet through friends, and I think it's interesting you said as well, perhaps the older cohort, because we know that historically. Uh, a really common developmental trend is, when people are teens, early adults, they have large friend groups. And as they get older, the friend group shrinks. And by about mid 30s, it's really, really common for most people to only have like one friend. Now we're seeing friend groups are shrinking much earlier in life. And we're also, still have that same pattern where older individuals may not have large friend groups. So where's a really good way to meet people for older individuals? Apps are a great way to meet people because you might not even have kind of that social opportunity,
Mm,
especially if you're
mm.
working a lot or something like that. You don't have a lot of leisure time. So yeah, it would make a lot of sense to me, and I'm not sure from the data offhand, but yeah, if we looked at older cohorts, perhaps we would see, that apps are again a really, really common way to meet, and it would make a lot of sense if they were.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I mean, also, by the time you get to my age, you may have known your friend cohort for a while,
Yeah,
and if you were going to date any of them, you would already have dated them,
right.
or they've all got married by this point. And a large proportion, at least when I was swiping on the apps, a large proportion of the men, most of the men, are divorced or separated, have children. Um, and so this is people's kind of hopefully second life chance at a long relationship that they are taking. Um, so that is that they met their first partners, their first wives in real life, and then they met their second partners on the apps. That's true of that's certainly true of myself, my current boyfriend, the two people I live with, who are both on their second marriages, and the first one was through the apps. Second one was meeting in real life. Sorry, the other way around. The first ones were in real life. The second ones were through apps. That seems to be a very common pattern. Do you feel
Yeah,
that
yeah.
the apps? Do you feel that the apps have changed what people how who people are choosing to date, what they value, and what the kind of atmosphere and feel of dating is like, the way people's dating and romantic behaviors?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, one thing we know that apps have done is they've expanded the mate pool. So you have many, many more potential mates to choose from, which can also kind of enhance competition or perceptions of competition. So, historically, if you go back far enough, human ancestors probably lived in groups of 100 or 200 or so. But even, relatively recent in history, it was very common for people to live in a small town with only some exposure to an immediate group of friends, perhaps, whatever the size of your high school would be or something like that, or the size of your college, but not you wouldn't see thousands of potential mates in one evening just swiping. So it's expanded the mate pool in that sense, which can increase perceptions of competition and also perhaps make people more selective, kind of like what I mentioned before. So another thing that it probably does is, on something like Tinder, we're just looking at pictures and we're swiping very fast. The profiles often aren't being read, although what is in a bio does matter. They do get read, and that increases matches a significant amount, up to 3 times for some. So it matters. But, we're swiping, we're just looking at pictures, and we're thinking, okay, I don't like the way they look. I don't like the way they look. The way people meet in person is through an interaction. And something we know from the research is that when women see a picture of a man, most men get rated pretty low. Just seeing a picture usually is not what does it for a woman. It's,
Yeah.
yeah, women have to interact a little bit and think like, I like the way he smiles, I like the way he talks, he has some charisma or something like that, and that can just make a guy. And we see that in research on speed dating, where we see when women rate photos, they rate them really low. Men get rated really, really low. When we look at speed dating ratings, they're a lot higher. So it's like, okay, when women interact with a man just for 5 minutes or something, changes their perception. And we know this is an effect that we have like the halo effect, but we also have what's called positive illusions. When you're closer to someone, when you interact with them, especially if it's a romantic partner or a friend or whatever, they get rated more attractive. So yeah, I think that's something else that makes it difficult for men. It's almost like if you don't pass kind of that looks test, so to speak, in your picture, then yeah, you're kind of filtered out. Whereas in an in-person interaction, that might have been someone who would have been perfectly attracted to that woman, especially once she saw him,
Mm,
interact a little bit
mm.
or something like that. And I think that's a big, big way that it has shifted the dynamic from the attractiveness of personal interaction to the attractiveness in a photo, and having to showcase your physical attractiveness in a photo as a man is kind of an uphill battle because women, they need a little bit more, I think, to like you.
Yeah, I read also that, and I think I read this from you, that both men and women rate more feminized faces as more attractive, um, more feminine features. So even though obviously heterosexual women aren't sexually attracted to other women, it seems that both sexes kind of agree that women are prettier.
Oh
Our
yeah.
eye prefers to see a more female or feminized face. So men are starting from a disadvantage when we're looking only at the faces. Smaller proportion of men look good than
Yeah.
women to our kind of human eyes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
men and women both rate men a little bit less attractive there on average, and yeah, even in male faces, the most dimorphic male face is usually not the most attractive. It's usually some kind of mix of features there. So it's usually not the most masculine face. If you think of a very masculine dimorphic face, it might look kind of like a gorilla or something like that. So it's usually, yeah, a little bit better. You know, there's kind of a mix there of masculine and feminine features that tend to make male faces seem more attractive. But yeah, as a guy, you know, if you know that women don't view most men attractive to begin with in pictures, having an app where it's showcasing pictures is probably not to your advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel that that is one of the things that men do wrong on apps is that they don't fill out the bio. And many of them actually write, there's no point in filling out the bio because people will just judge on photos, which I don't think is true at all. Um, and if your photo isn't that great, then the bio is your best shot. If your bio sounds interesting, then you might well get a date in real life, and then that might change the perception of your looks. Um,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you know, there's a lot of research just on having a bio can increase matches up to 3 times. Things that are in the bio, like having a higher level of education. So we know that women read the bios, and you know, they might see a picture and look and be like, "Oh, there's no bio. Swipe left. I don't want to deal with it." Or they might see someone and think, "Oh, that's kind of okay." And then they see the bio and they think, "Yeah, I'm convinced now. Swipe right." So yeah, you have to have a good bio, and probably the more information that you provide. I've done a little bit of research on dating app deal breakers, and one thing we know with the bios is like people don't like negative information. So the bio should not be a list of like, I don't want this, I don't want that. It should tell you like positive things about yourself. If you're saying those things, if you gave an example that you said a man has a bio and he's like, I'm not going to write a bio because women just look at pictures. Like that is not the kind of bio that's going to help.
no. There are also a lot of people complaining in their bios,
Yeah.
and I kind of feel for them. They write things like, "No woman has ever swiped right on me. Nobody has ever matched with me. Please, please, someone match with me," which is not a winning strategy
Yeah, that's
because
not
it
a good bio.
immediately makes you feel if you swipe right that indicates that you have poor judgment because there must be a reason why no other woman has done so.
Right.
It's like a negative recommendation.
Yeah, yeah.
If you sent in a CV for a job and under your recommendations it says, "Here are all the other people who didn't hire me, who rejected me from this job."
No one will hire me. Please give me a job.
Yeah, exactly. Um, what are the most surprising deal breakers that you found for men and for women?
Yeah. Oh, I would have to think off the top of my head. Certainly, I think some of the big ones are perhaps the least surprising. Yeah, so a big one for men and women both was having kids. So wanting to date a single parent was a kind of a large one up there. Um, and that's more for women. Yeah, so men are a little bit less likely to want to date a single parent than women are to men. But yeah, that's kind of a disadvantage. And that's something that happens later in life. If you're dating as an older individual, a lot of people are going to have kids, and maybe they're going to be more compromising about it. But an interesting one, we asked some like physical features. I think some that are controversial, like different political opinions, is going to be one. But of course, you can't please everyone with political opinions. Someone's
Is
going to have.
is there a sex is there a sex difference in that? I.e., is sharing the same political opinions more important to men or to women?
I think it was
Or have you
slightly
not
more.
noticed a difference?
I think it was slightly more important to women in that, but it was kind of similar there. There was an interesting one for one that men didn't like in women, which was having a septum piercing, which is
Ew.
the nose piercing here. So that's kind of a new
Yeah, I
fashion
don't
trend,
blame
but
them.
yeah, yeah, that's something I've looked into in a few different surveys because it was always something that kind of stood out to me. Like, this is kind of a new trend. Men find that attractive, and it's remarkable, kind of across the board, how large of a deal breaker that actually was.
Mm,
So,
mm.
as far as
I'm always,
attractiveness goes, yeah.
yeah, I'm always surprised by the. I mean, it's intuitive to me that fashion and trends for women in particular should be geared towards looking attractive, including looking attractive to men. Um, but it's surprising how orthogonal many fashion trends are to that, or even hostile to that. There was one fashion blog which was called The Man Repeller. Um, and I think there was even a kind of trend that was called the Man Repeller trend. Um, um, and yeah, um,
We
I
did
think
a survey on beauty standards and beauty enhancement standards and what things men would find most attractive. And the things that all got the highest ratings were very much just like basic, very basic standard beauty things like body hair removal, for example. And the ones that got really low ratings that men were like, that is actually unattractive. Again, it was things like the septum piercing or lip piercings or
yeah.
or like lip fillers or extreme cosmetic surgery and all of that. Which, you see these, Brazilian butt lift or whatever, these really extreme surgeries. And it's like, okay, so what can women really do to make themselves more attractive to men specifically? And it is really just kind of like the very basic grooming things, like paint your nails and like shave your armpits, as opposed to like I need to get like lip fillers and major plastic surgery.
Do you think there's a difference between men's preferences in kind of fantasy scenarios, like, for example, viewing porn or subscribing to OnlyFans accounts or something like that, and their preferences in when they're in real life scenarios, like, for example, looking on the apps at people they might want to date, or meeting women and deciding whether they find those women attractive in real life? Um, because I have this kind of theory, I guess, that the porn and some of the OnlyFans accounts, there there are a couple of people I know who have OnlyFans accounts and who've had very extreme surgeries, and they really look like cartoons. That is a kind of super stimulus, like, how the when cuckoos invade another. Well, I'm sure you know this concept, but just in case anybody listening isn't familiar, when cuckoos invade, lay their eggs in another bird's nest, when the cuckoos are hatched, they're often larger than the bird's actual chicks, and birds respond very strongly to what's called the gape, the wide open chick's wide open red mouth makes the birds want to put food down, regurgitate food down there. That's a strong kind of parental urge. And the cuckoo's mouths are larger and their gape is especially large, especially red and appealing. And they end up getting fed more than the bird's own chicks. And that's a kind of super stimulus. And I think they've even done experiments where they had a kind of puppet and they made an artificial gaping beak, even larger, just ridiculous, like 10 times the size of any chick. And the birds went over there and put the food in there, neglecting their actual chicks. Kind of extraordinary. And I wonder to what extent, some of the preferences in porn and in OnlyFans work like that, and whether there's correlation or mismatch between real life preferences.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think that is the case, and so a lot of these trends kind of do come from porn. I've heard that idea of the super stimulus as well. I was talking to Mac and Murphy the other day, and he described that in the case of, I think they're called swordtail fish. And so, what's
Yeah.
attractive essentially to the opposite sex in these fish? I hope I'm remembering it correctly. Was kind of the size of the tail, or maybe it was the size of the nose. I don't know if it's one of those swordfish, but they put the prosthetic on it, and it's like, yeah, and then suddenly they attract more mates, even if it's this excessive one. So yeah, we see this effect across animals. This sort of super stimulus that it would be much much larger, and we see this kind of in sexual selection as well, like in the peacock's tail. These sexual stimuli that are attractive that probably don't actually benefit the bird very much, but they just keep getting selected and enhanced over time because the female birds like it, or something like that. And yeah, I do wonder to what extent we see these extreme plastic surgeries. I bet there's individual variation there where this has a much stronger effect on some men because across the board, when I ask men, a lot these things actually got pretty low ratings, but at the same time, you do see that they kind of carve out a niche, don't they? Where these
True.
people get like extreme fans that have extreme plastic surgery. So I suspect there's individual variation there, that these super stimuli can have a much stronger effect on some people. Yeah, humans are pretty variable in personality, so that would kind of make sense. I don't know to what extent there would be a mismatch there in that, like in their actual real life preferences and the pornography preferences. I couldn't say. I can only guess. I would imagine it would actually be kind of stable. Like I would imagine most of those guys, if they like that in porn, they probably like someone who looks like that in real life also. But behaviorally, maybe not, because people are into things in pornography that can be like shameful to them and all of that and arousing, but they might not actually like that in a real relationship. So sometimes pornography can be a way to explore fantasies and things like that they might actually be really uncomfortable with in a real relationship. But I can only kind of guess as far as that goes.
Yeah. Do you think porn has detrimental effects? I mean, I've heard a lot of different views on this. The detrimental effects would come from, for one thing, especially for younger men who are more sexually inexperienced, that it's unrealistic. So you have women, like many women, groaning and moaning and having orgasms with absolutely like zero clitoral stimulation, which is
Mhm.
statistically unlikely. And also, some very in porn, they always go at each other in this incredibly rough way. It looks like the clitoris would be just sandpapered right off if you did this in real life. Um, and so there's and these are actors, of course. So there's a possible lack of realism. And the other problem might be the sort of, I guess, the fake fitness thing. This is an idea that I know Diana Fleischman, I don't know if she originated it, but I know that she talks about this, which is that um, you don't go out and get a real girlfriend because your body sort of signals to you that you had an orgasm in the presence of an attractive woman, and therefore you somehow fulfilled your evolutionary purpose, even though the woman is on a screen, because we didn't evolve to uh, feel a strong psychological difference between those things. I don't know how you feel about either of those theories.
Yeah, sure. It's a complex topic. So I do think there's something to that, that pornography can act as a surrogate for actual mating. And I mean, what seems to make this very clear to me is there's whole entire communities of men that will tell you this, like
Mm,
MGTOW and all that, men going their own way. They'll say, I'm perfectly content with porn. Some of them, smaller percentages, I'm perfectly content with these sex dolls. We know that men can fulfill kind of this mating urge and everything as a surrogate with like pornography or whatever the case may be. Probably there's a little bit more subtle than that as well, is like someone who uses all porn all the time, maybe they're just not as motivated to go out and get their sexual needs fulfilled or their romantic needs fulfilled or whatever the case may be, their mating needs. They're like, I'm just done for the day, I'm going to play video games and eat now, I'm not
mm.
going to go to the bar and spend all evening talking to women or something like that. So I think that's very plausible effect
And
there.
for some people, it could be good because, I
Yeah.
mean, some men who are very unattractive, for example, men who have severe disabilities, it might be a good outlet for them, and it might be actually quite unlikely or unrealistic that they would find a real life partner.
Yeah. I mean, there's kind of that theory as well that pornography has provided a release for less desirable men that might actually kind of reduce violence on a social scale. I'm not sure to what extent that's empirically supported, but there's kind of a theoretical thing that is kind of like, yeah, if we can keep men pacified a little bit, they're less likely to engage in antisocial behavior. That's one. I think another way that, and I think that is well supported in the research, that porn can be problematic in relationships is we know that a lot of women don't like their partners using porn. But nonetheless, their partners continue to use porn. For a lot of women, porn use is kind of like cheating. It can be varies depend on that. So if we know that a lot of women don't like this, a lot of men are in relationships with women like this, they have a conflict over porn. And in situations
Mm.
like that, like yeah, you have a problem, and it's not even just a question of like is the porn bad or not or whatever. It's like you have a conflict and incongruence with your values and the values of the other person, and so that's one way. Another way, we know that men who use porn excessively and masturbate excessively can become desensitized. They can desensitize themselves often from like very vigorous masturbation to the point that sex is no longer desirable for them, doesn't feel as good for them as masturbating. Probably, the stimulus that they're receiving during actually having sex with their partner might not be as extreme as what they're used to in porn
The
either. So
death
they're
grip.
not
Yeah.
the death grip, yeah. So physically and also the kind of extreme stimulus that they're seeing, because
Mm,
some porn
mm.
is kind of vanilla, some porn starts getting really, really extreme, and it's like, yeah, perhaps they're getting kind of that. There's another, effect of novelty. So porn gives you exposure to a bunch of different women. So if some men are much more oriented towards sexual novelty, they crave that more, and others less. So it's kind of like you see men occasionally choosing to look at porn rather than have sex with the person they're in a relationship with. So that's another problem there. Like looking at why that might be. I think the research on like is porn bad for the brain or something is pretty mixed. It's not great, so I don't really know about that for sure. But I
Mm.
think there's a lot of reasons to think like, okay, there are lots of examples and instances of problematic porn use.
What do you think are some of the biggest misunderstandings people have about data? So, dating. What are some of the big arguments that you have with people from the black pill community, who I see you arguing with often on Twitter? You're doing the Lord's work there. Thank you. Um, I mean, one thing I have noticed is the overemphasis on looks, and that many of the incels um, are fixated on the idea that the reason they can't get a girlfriend is because they are ugly. And many of them are actually not ugly. In fact, they look fine, but it's
Yeah.
probably their manner um, that is off-putting to women, an attitude.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's a big one. That's kind of the core doctrine of the black pill is like it's all looks, and so incels that overlap with that black pill ideology, they will say the only reason women don't like me is because I'm really really ugly. We don't know what these guys look like. There's never been a sample of incels that actually compares even their attractiveness, so they could just be on average as attractive as the average man. Something else is
Mm.
going on there, and we do have more research on we know that they're much more likely to have anxiety or depression, much more likely to have autism, and autism is a big, big barrier to relationship formation, unfortunately. So a lot of people that suffer from that have difficulty forming relationships, making that kind of connection, reading cues in the emotions of the other person, and that sort of a thing. I did a little bit that indicated they might have higher hostile attribution bias. So they see that when other people are acting in a neutral way or not positively, that they interpret it in a hostile way. But a good example of that is, the Elliot Rodger, the incel who did a shooting. He had a manifesto, and he was not someone that was unattractive. He was
Mm.
as attractive as any other normal guy with a girlfriend. Many men that look like him have normal relationships, so he was not an ugly guy. But we saw from his manifesto he had some pretty severe mental health issues, and one of those issues was kind of related to that hostile attribution bias, where he would see, for example, a couple that was just kind of minding their own business, and he would think they hate me, they're thinking about me, they're laughing at me. And so if you run through life, with this, but I mean, these are like severe instances of mental illness. Yeah, some past research as well that I've done has indicated that incels have a higher aversion to risk, so they're much more afraid of rejection. For example, they're afraid of talking to women and all of that. So you have kind of this cluster of psychological traits, behavioral traits, and all of that that probably explain more about why they're incels basically than just like looks do in that case.
Mm. Mm. What do you think are some of the other big misunderstandings or bad strategies? Let's
Sure,
start with
sure.
men, and then we'll go to women as well. What are some of men's biggest misunderstandings of what's happening, and also um, biggest mistakes?
Sure. So I think a big misunderstanding that men have is probably overestimating the extent to which women pursue casual sex. So kind of an overestimation of promiscuity, and that's also kind of related to the black pill thing. I think there's a general overestimation of promiscuity and an orientation toward promiscuity that we tend to see. Most people, a pretty sizable minority is just not having much sex at all. But most people are having sex, about 90%, if they're having sex at all, it's in the context of a committed relationship. So people tend to be serial monogamous. Men and women both. They tend to prefer to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. That seems to be what they pursue. They stay in these relationships for, medium, long periods of time. They're having sex mostly exclusively with that person. Occasionally infidelity or something happens, but whatever. And it's very rare that, people are having a bunch of hookups and friends with benefits. This is kind of, the so-called promiscuous 10% that you see
Yeah.
in the STD epidemiology kind of literature, that, this is men and women that tend to kind of just be moving in these circles of promiscuity kind of themselves, among themselves. So I think that's something that men in particular get wrong. And I think it's driven a lot by popular dating discourse where they bring OnlyFans stars on podcasts and interview them and like, I had sex with 300 people. So they're kind of taking, the promiscuous 10%, even the promiscuous 1% kind of as their model for like normal female behavior. I think that's something
Yeah,
there
yeah.
that men kind of are getting wrong, especially young men.
Yeah, and men tend to overestimate women's sexual interest in them.
Yes.
Um, as I think every woman has experienced many times. Um, yeah, I mean, especially when you're a young woman, you have to really. I think that a lot of one of the misunderstandings about young women's behavior is that many people perceive some young women as being very standoffish, snobby, kind of bitchy towards men, and they have developed. Some people are just, some people are gratuitously nasty. I'm not discounting that at all. But in some cases, at least, they've developed that strategy because if you're not outright like fuck off, then
Okay.
the guy will take it. anything
Yeah.
anything below that will be taken as potential encouragement.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
um,
So
yeah.
something
So
I
what?
think you were going to
Yes,
ask
go
as
on.
well, what do women get wrong about men, right?
Yeah. First, I had another question, which
Oh,
is
yes, there
about
is.
infidelity in
Oh, sure.
relationships. Do you have stats on that? What proportion of people are unfaithful in monogamous relationships, and is there a sex difference in that ratio?
Sure. So I was reading a paper the other day about mate poaching by David Buss. He says, infidelity can range between 25% to 50% in relationships across the board. So it's pretty common. There's a really robust sex difference in infidelity that we've seen across the years and across the literature where men tend to cheat more. And this is uh, validated, not just, people say, oh, well, this is self-reports. Maybe men just admit it more. But no, it occurs in the reports of others as well. So, for example, men will report of their girlfriends cheating less, or their wives they've divorced cheating less. Wives, girlfriends will report of their unfaithful partners cheating more. We see it kind of in the mate poaching literature as well, that men and women report like, have you been successfully poached away or something like that. So we see congruence there. So pretty much across all of these different measures that we can look at, yeah, men tend to cheat more than women do. And this is, of course, consistent with the evolutionary rationales for why men would benefit much more from the ancestral evolutionary perspective from cheating, right? So we have this dominant human mating pattern that's serial monogamy, but there's kind of that side strategy there. It's like, okay, as a man, if he can cheat, you can maximize genetic fitness, increase it by being more promiscuous. So you have investment in one partner, you're investing in those offspring, they're more likely to survive, but you can spread your genes in other ways. For women, infidelity would be much, much riskier, related to the risks associated with pregnancy in general, with losing the current mate, with the physical harm that can occur from another man, because men have historically, been simply physically dangerous to women. So there's a lot there that explains why we see a sex difference in promiscuity. Again, that's another thing I think a lot of kind of the manosphere popular dating discourse gets wrong, because it's kind of like they kind of deny that sex difference exists. And when people
Mm.
have these dating narratives that are just kind of like, I'm mad at women, I'm mad at men, of course they're going to be like, no, women cheat more, women cheat all the time, but yeah, I mean, that's kind of what the research shows. We do see a sex difference there.
Yeah, and it seems that there's a difference in motivation. David Buss was saying this
Oh, yes.
in his book, um, that men are men compartmentalize more, and they are more likely to be unfaithful, even though they're happy in the relationship,
Yes.
because they meet someone they're attracted to, or they even seek out someone to have sex with because they're looking for variety, or they're even if they're satisfied with their sex life with a partner, and especially if they're unsatisfied. Whereas women generally have affairs when they're deeply unsatisfied with the relationship, and they're much more likely to report falling in love, being in love with a lover. Um,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a very important one there. That men and women cheat for different reasons. Men are more likely to cheat. And it's interesting. There was a recent paper that looked at a website for infidelity. This was a website that had a big, big survey. They had a sample size of about 70,000. So this was people that had committed an infidelity, that had been, experienced it or whatever. They could go and take this survey, and basically they replicated what David Buss had previously noted from the past research. Yeah, that men are much more willing to have one night stands than women, or men have one night stands as affairs much more than women do, indicating that it's more of a sex thing. Men cite sex as a motive much more than women do, and women are much more likely to say that they have an emotional connection with the affair partner, much more likely to want to leave the relationship, to be in a relationship with the affair partner. So that's another interesting thing too, is we kind of have these two ideas in evolutionary psychology, like dual mating. So, long-term, short-term mating strategies that can kind of overlap. And then there's also mate switching, which is like, how do people choose to go from one relationship to another relationship, right? So in that case, we might see that infidelity for women is very closely associated with mate switching, right? That when women are
mm,
unfaithful, it's often the case that, they're not just trying to have sex on the side or secure the good genes of a man, but rather they would prefer to kind of go on and have a new relationship with the affair partner, who they very often, according to Buss's research, I think it was upwards of 70% have fallen in love with. Yeah.
mm. Yeah, yeah. I think there's a lot of kind of failure of cross-sex theory of mind
Hmm.
around in general. And one place I see it is in those black-pilled people often have these cartoons which have women with a kind of whole string of men. The woman is waiting like on a bed or something, or I think doggy style is one of their
Yeah.
preferred things. And there's a big queue of men, and she's like eagerly waiting to have sex with all of these men. And that is just like 1% of women. That is a very small proportion of women who would find that situation at all appealing. Um, and they kind of present themselves as having, if you're the real boyfriend type, um, there's one in which all the men are horn dogs apart from this one who is in a suit and he's carrying roses in
Right.
a little briefcase. And um, they're implying that he will have to compete to wait his turn whilst all these oversexed Chad types have sex with the woman first. And of course, that would not happen. The woman would just ignore all the Chad types and she would go straight for the boyfriend man with his briefcase and flowers. Um, so that's their own fantasy, their own kind of wild fantasy of having of extreme promiscuity, just projected onto women who just don't feel that way. And that's the kind of tragedy. Women, younger, attractive women get all the offers, but we don't actually want them. We don't actually
Right.
want them. Um,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you made a very good point there. That's their own fantasy. The men that say this,
mm,
they're projecting a fear, when they have this long thing, and that's probably a fear of essentially cuckoldry, right? You see some of these accounts, these incel accounts, all of their memes are about cuckoldry, about being cucked by someone else, and there's related to this is social comparisons, retroactive jealousy. So if you have a man who is not very sexually experienced, we know that they can feel very, very insecure with a woman who is more sexually experienced. And if you watch the discourse of these men, they will describe in detail about like, she's probably thinking about like Chad's dick or whatever. And it's like, these men are making comparisons in their minds. Like, am I going to live up to these other men? Is there going to be another man that's more attractive than me, better than me, or something like that? And so, in a few of the surveys I've run, we see that men with more sexual partners, men who rate themselves as more attractive, they care less about a woman with more sexual partners. The men that really seem to want women with fewer sexual partners are the men who are much less experienced themselves, and it's probably related to those comparisons they're making in their mind, those fears that they're not going to live up to past partners. And it's future fears as well. The fears like, oh, she's very promiscuous. She will leave me for Chad, right? She's gonna cuck me. She's gonna leave me for someone who's better. So a lot of these memes and everything, yeah, they're entirely projections of their own fears in that sense.
how important do you think body count is to people, to men and to women, i.e., the number of previous partners? I actually think, somewhat perversely, that it's somewhat important to me, that if I knew that a man had sex with 100 women previously, I would probably avoid that guy. So I'm even though I've known many men among my friends who've had slutty pasts and are now reformed characters because um, they they've they're looking, they have different goals, and also probably their testosterone levels have just dropped, and so they're not as motivated in that direction. um but I feel very wary, when, and I feel much more at ease if I think the man has had relatively few sexual partners, but not none. At my age, that
Yeah.
would also be kind of extraordinary. um
Well, what you said is very consistent with the past research. I think Andrew Thomas and Steve Stewart William, if I remember correctly, they did a paper on this and they found
hmm,
exactly what you said. What's the ideal body count for men and women? It's about the same. It's about three partners, and then men and women are pretty tolerant. I think up to about 10 or so, and then you start to see it drop off. But men and women perceive it very similar. Zero is not the ideal for men or for women. The ideal is like, two or three or something like that. So it's kind of like a little bit of experience, but not too much. And I think something a lot of men don't realize is also related to what you said. Men see body count in other men as a really, really robust status cue. So men will even lie to other men and brag about it, even as like teenagers. Like you can be
hmm,
13 and they'll be like, "Yeah, I had sex with someone." And it's like you probably didn't because you're only 13. But even teens will like kind of lie to each other about this. So men are signaling this like, "I have a lot of sexual success," as a status cue to other men. And I think men don't realize the extent to which a high body count in men is unattractive to women and can be a deal breaker in women. And in some of the surveys
hmm,
I've done on body count, kind of a similar thing. I found maybe about 30% to half of men and women, they just don't ask at all. And they're less likely to care. I found about 5 to 10% have asked on dates and said it's too high and they've left. And typically what is too high in the surveys I ran, for men it was pretty much kind of anything over 20 is when you start to see like the average, what people said was like a deal breaker. And for women it was actually higher. It was about 40. So there was a little bit of a different, well, I should say that was a pretty substantial difference, but that's an average thing. So, it's probably higher for men and women both, and as like an actual deal breaker, like when is too much really too much? We know a lot of people are not asking, so they probably don't care that much. And yeah, it's kind of one of those situations where at the same time the ideal is low for men and women both. No one wants
hmm.
someone that's had a lot of sexual partners, which again, it makes sense.
Yeah, I it's important to me, but I also don't ask. Um, um, so I don't usually find out until I'm actually in the relationship already. Um,
Yeah, I mean, and that does kind of raise a question because yeah, I could kind of feel the same way. Like it's important, but like, am I really going to push to ask? And if you don't, then it's like, well, how important is it? Because apparently some people are just asking right out on a date, or at least so they say. And it's kind of like you're looking at this as like a really important thing to just like weed people out immediately. And I mean, there's some importance there because we know that high promiscuity is associated with things that you might not like in a long term relationship. It's associated with more infidelity. There's a risk of disease, of course. There's a risk of personality traits, perhaps, things like higher dark triad that you wouldn't like.
mm,
This isn't going
mm.
to apply to every individual, of course, but, on average. So it can be kind of a yellow flag, perhaps a red flag for some people to see a really, really high body count, just incongruence of values and kind of, again, the jealousy thing. Maybe you don't want to, have to compare yourself with a bunch of past partners or something like that.
Mm, mm. Yeah, or a bunch of potential present ones. I think that's
Yeah.
more more the problem.
Right.
um, so, what are some of the mistakes that women make, and misconceptions that women have, and failures of cross-sex mind reading on our part?
So I think something that's perhaps a little bit of a black pill for women is that there's a lot of discourse in the manosphere like men don't care about your education or your career or something that actually seems to be kind of true if we look at like dating app matches that a woman that indicates a high level of education or something like that, the profiles actually get a little bit fewer matches. So men, when they're assessing someone in a relationship, they tend to like certain personality traits. if it's like kindness or agreeableness, and men really, really value physical attractiveness a lot. And I think women want to be valued for more than that, which is very reasonable. Like, like, look, I'm a very accomplished person. I'm smart. I have all of these things. And some men really do value that. But on average, a lot of men just kind of completely ignore that. And I think women sometimes try to signal desirability with that when perhaps it doesn't right off the bat. And that's kind of a, perhaps a little bit of a black pill for women. And it is maybe something that men should think about more, because we know, like, high level of education in women is associated with much lower divorce. So that is something I think women also probably overestimate the extent to which men are going to cheat, or the extent to which men are going to uh, want more sexual novelty or short term uh, sexual goals or something like that, because men have men are pretty open to sexual novelty and promiscuity, but men also indicate a very high orientation or desire for monogamy. So most men want to be in a relationship, most men want to have a girlfriend or a wife or something like that, and most of them are pretty able to commit and do that. So I think some women tend to think like everyone is going to cheat, that's male nature. They have kind of a very dark aspect of male nature, like they're always going to want sexual variety, boys will be boys, so to speak. And it's like it probably overestimates the extent to which men are going to pursue kind of that novel sexuality in a sense.
Mm. Yeah, and it will lead you to set your bar too low if you have that
Yeah.
attitude. If you're expecting that from everybody, yeah, it's better to just set your bar of where where you want it to
Yeah.
be. Um, and I assume there's a kind of age difference here as well, that I kind of assume that men become more monogamously inclined, less likely to stray as they get older. Is that actually the case?
So I'm
What
not
does the
sure that
data say
that's.
on that?
I'm.
Mm.
I would think maybe there is a shift with time, but I'm not sure to how large that shift is, because what we're looking at here is sociosexuality, a personality variable, and this tends to be
Mm,
pretty
mm,
stable over time, like most of personality. If someone is much more inclined to short-term mating when they are young, they're going to be much more inclined to short-term mating when they're old as well, and that's going to be pretty stable. And yeah, it could drop off a little bit, but I'm not sure entirely to the extent of that. But I think one thing happens, beyond personality traits, is that as people get older, they learn, and they learn to make better decisions, and they calm down a lot. And we know that they engage in less risk behavior, and this is something that's really robustly reflected in like crime behavior, like the age crime curve. That violent crime, it just plummets by like the late 20s to 30s and just stays down, and so do other kind of risk behaviors. So, as far as like people seeking promiscuity and having casual sex and all of that, yeah, I would expect that. And again, we see people are much more likely to get into long-term monogamous relationships in their late 20s and their 30s as well. So, yeah, I would kind of expect that something's happening, late 20s, early 30s and onward, where people are settling down basically, and probably a mixture of things going on there.
mm. So you sorry, I kind of um slightly missed that first point. So you think that women are overestimating the amount to which men are completely uninterested in the woman's career, education, etc. That men are actually a bit more interested in that than women think. Women think it's completely unimportant, but they're wrong. Or
Oh no, I think it's kind of the other way around. I think some women
okay,
want men to really value them for that more, and men might not care as much about that
okay, yeah.
as they think that they should in that sense.
Mm. I did encounter on Tinder. I feel that on Tinder and the other apps are the same in my opinion. Certainly in my age group, there's really no difference between one app and another. They all have the same feel. They all have the same people are actually on them. You actually see the same profiles. And so on the apps, there are certain memes that take hold. I noticed. So suddenly you get every man's bio says has a particular specific joke in it, a really bad joke, which do not put any jokes in your bio, because any joke will be in 500 other bios that the woman has already swiped through that day. Please bear that in mind, men.
That's good.
Um, so there's certain kind of trends, and I think this might have been a trend, but I did notice a few profiles that said, um, I own my own flat, and this is here in Sydney, where a small flat begins at 1 million Aussie. It's about 500,000 US.
Oh wow.
Um, I have a great job, and I own my own flat, and I'm looking for a woman who is similar or who has similar. Um, so I feel like they're almost saying in their profile, the woman's net worth must be a minimum of 750,000. That would be a kind of really crass thing to say. So they didn't say
Right.
that. Um, and I was quite surprised by that, because the straw poll of my male friends, acquaintances, and everybody, pretty much everyone I've ever asked in real life about this, every man I've ever asked has told me that they are uh, the amount of a woman's the woman's finances. I guess if the woman was deeply in debt or something, or addicted to gambling, that would be different. But um, the woman's salary and kind of finances and bank balance and savings, and or whether she owns property, etc., are just completely irrelevant to them.
Hmm.
Totally, totally irrelevant. Um, and I do wonder whether the men in those profiles are, whether it is the woman's net worth is actually important to them, or whether it is a defense mechanism that they don't want to be exploited themselves. So
Hmm.
they feel if the woman has plenty of money herself, then they don't run so much risk. Um, I don't know whether you've
Yeah,
come across
yeah.
that, whether you have a feeling about it.
Yeah, sometimes you see profiles with bios in that also, and it's like a man will list a bunch of things and it'll be like, "What do you bring to the table?" And I wonder if it's kind of a similar thing like that as well, where it's like,
Mm.
I want someone who has similar or something, and then when he doesn't get any matches, he can be like, "Oh yeah, they're not meeting my standard" or something like that. But
Yeah, maybe
yeah, yeah,
self-sabotage. It feels a little bit self-sabotaging. I mean,
hmm
that is a big demand to be making. I
yeah,
checked my bank balance, and then I swipe left on those guys. Um, um, but it does seem that women are more concerned, for reasons that seem really obvious in evolutionary terms, more concerned with material welfare. And I think there was some study, I don't know if you cited this or if it was Diana or one of the other evolutionary psychology people I follow, cited a study. It was about men and women and driving licenses. And I think they made fake profiles, and
mhm.
it was both the men and the women said that they couldn't drive. And the men who said that they didn't drive all got swiped left upon. And for the women, it was completely immaterial.
Yeah.
None of the men cared at all, but the women did care. They didn't. They didn't swipe on the men who said that they couldn't drive.
Yeah, that sounds like one of those things. Yeah, related to resources and also related to status. Like, yeah, and that's
Competence,
something
yeah.
incompetence. Yeah, that's something I think that's attractive to women very early in their teens. Is like, does he have a car? Can he drive, or something like that?
Yeah.
And if men don't make it, to a certain point in their life with a driver's license, especially in the United States, then you really wonder like what's going on there. It's interesting because some research is showing that the youngest generation are getting driver's licenses much later in life, and they're also having sex much later in life. And that also kind of makes you wonder if we know that like there's an effect of not having a driver's license that makes you less desirable as a man, and we know Zoomers are waiting longer to get driver's licenses. Is that kind of contributing there, kind of to the sex recession that it's been called in the Zoomers or something like that? I mean, it could be, yeah, but there's a lot there that women seem to care about. I do think, though, something about resources specifically, when you look at speed dating studies and all of that, find economic resources and all that, it matters more for women, but it's really, really low, actually. So women kind of have these stated preferences, and even then, they're a little bit lower than other things. And so it's kind of like, yeah, I think women do care about this more than men. That's a really, really robust sex differences, the ability to provide resources. But I think if you rank it and you see like to what extent does it actually matter? Is it a deal breaker? I think women are perfectly happy to date a guy who's just kind of getting by as long as they like him for other reasons, as opposed to being
Yeah.
like extreme gold diggers, which is another thing. I think a lot of the discourse is like women really love money, they love money and all that. And it's like women love a lot of things more than they love money. I
Yeah.
mean, maybe that helps, but like, it's kind of down on the list.
Yeah, I think also there's a big difference between people's stated and revealed preferences in this. that if you are serving people and you ask them what they want, then they will give you a description of their ideal. But then what they actually settle for is different, and not
Yeah,
even may
exactly.
not
Yeah.
even seem like settling. It may be more that attractions are. Uh, um, uh, Once the attraction is there, you are. Other things don't seem as important. Um, but
Yeah,
if you're
yeah,
asked for your
absolutely.
ideal, then you're gonna put down your laundry list.
Yeah.
And that's why
Yeah,
you
if
get all
you
these interviews with young women saying they want to date a guy who earns at least 200,000, and that's only like 3% of men in their age group. And um, yeah, but nevertheless, most of these young women do get into relationships, and those men are not, clearly they can't all be earning the amount that they say is the minimum that they require.
Yeah, absolutely. Women, and I think that's one of the things that has kind of contribute to the black pill is you see women on the videos that make it into TikTok and go viral where they'd be like, I want a man who makes $200,000 and who's 6 feet tall and who has a six pack. And it's like you start adding these things on, it's like there's very few men like that. But then in reality, those women are going to date the guy that they met in their class at the university.
Ew,
He doesn't have
ew,
a job, he's
mm.
just a student. And they're going to be like, I like him, and they're going to date him, and they're going to get married. And that's like real mate selection there. Yeah, if you make a list of all of these requirements, then it's most people aren't going to meet those, and like most people don't have those as like a real baseline requirement. At the end of the day, people meet people and they like them because they like them, and if they fall short on a bunch of other like ideal preferences, that almost doesn't seem to matter at all for like who people pick.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I used to be an Argentine tango professional Argentine tango teacher, and that is a scene in which there's a often an imbalance. There are more women than men, and some women do dance the man's role or dance the male role, the leader's role, at least some of the time, which helps with the imbalance. It's more fun to dance than not to dance. But even in that scene, there is a significant minority of men who just do not get chosen for dances. Um, and um, women, uh, that scene really kind of seems to reflect the dating scene in some striking ways. I feel one is this kind of, even in this climate which is very numerically favorable to men, um, where women really, really want to dance, and there aren't enough men to go around to dance with. Still, nevertheless, there's always this proportion, maybe 5%, 10% of men who just can't get any woman to dance with them at all, or very few and very seldom, or only out of kind of pity. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so there's a surprisingly kind of robust sort of floor for women's preferences, for one thing. Women will not dance with just anyone, even when they're desperate to dance. Um, and those men often kind of they overestimate the distance between what would be necessary for them to improve for the women to dance with them, and what um, uh, 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 they overestimate that distance between where they are and where that minimum
Mm-hmm.
floor for women's preferences is. And they say, well, these women just want to dance with the very best dancers. Um, and in fact, that's not the case. They would get dancers if they were just like this much better. They wouldn't have to be
Yeah.
all the way up here. And I feel the same thing happening in dating discourse, that some guys are like, well, the woman only wants to date Brad Pitt. My reference to Brad Pitt is completely outdated. So just insert whoever the current good looking men are. From my generation, it was Brad Pitt. So they, um, uh, these women just want to date Brad Pitt, that makes them feel better about themselves, because obviously this is an unrealistic barrier to jump, and they don't like to feel that actually it's only this much that they're not managing to
Yeah.
bridge. Um,
Yeah, that sounds a lot. Yeah, like the dating discourse you see with incels and the black pill and all of that. They're like, yeah, women will only date this giga Chad, and we're just down here at the very bottom. And it's like, women are dating like the average guy. You can walk down the street and you see a million couples that look like whatever, and it's like you could probably do it too. The level of improvement is very small. Yeah, and that's something you see across animals as well. All of the different species of animals is there's always a portion of males that get excluded. And in some animals, it's very extreme. It can be 90% of males. In humans, over the last 2,000 years or so, it's been about 10 to 20% of males that don't mate. And typically, women are more likely to. So, yeah, it does seem to be the case that there's always kind of this bottom tier of men that doesn't make it and that maybe doesn't exist as strongly for women. I'm sure there's that for women, but it would be a smaller percentage as well.
Yeah,
But,
it's definitely
it's,
smaller. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, one difference though between tango and dating is that there's a really, well, I don't know, this is somewhat of a difference. There's a very, very striking difference in people's motivations for choice of dance partners. Um, so even though this is a dance where you hold each other very closely in a kind of romantic way, you move in a very intimate way, um, women generally, of course, there are outlier exceptions in both camps, but in general, women do not care at all about the man's looks or level of kind of physical and general sexual attractiveness. They want a good experience on the dance floor. The man could have three heads or be Quasimodo. It doesn't matter if the experience on the dance floor is good. And also, likewise, a man who is very good looking but cannot dance, he'll get a few dances at first before people realize, but as soon as word gets out that he's not a good dancer, he won't dance anymore, won't dance very much, even if he's absolutely drop dead gorgeous. Whereas, although there's probably a larger proportion of men who do prioritize dance skills over looks, but many men, although they would prefer a woman who is good looking and also dances well, will be quite ready to dance with a woman who they will have to drag around the dance floor like a
Yeah.
sack of bricks, which will be hurting their back and treading on their toe and kneeing them in the groin and who knows what, if she looks good. So a woman who is good looking, who just can barely dance a step, will definitely dance and maybe dance all night.
Hmm.
Um, so there's a big difference there in men's and women's motivations.
Yeah, that's interesting. That also kind of mirrors the mate selection literature, doesn't it? That men are selecting for attractiveness, but less for skills or competence. So, like a
Mm,
woman's
mm.
career or university or whatever maybe doesn't matter as much to them. But for women, maybe they're prioritizing looks a little bit less, but their competence, big deal. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, in dance, competence is everything.
Yeah,
That's it. Looks don't even matter. Competence
definitely.
is
Yeah.
the thing. Um, what's your I wanted to ask about Gen Z. I don't know too many Gen Zers in real life, and um, I have heard a lot of kind of horror stories about the dating scene for Gen Z, and I guess it's also now Gen Alpha is kind of beginning. I don't know if Gen Alpha are at the age of sexual debut yet, but those very young people, um, and I think that two things that I've heard. One is that they are not having much sex. And in general, just interacting less in person, more through screens, and yeah, having a lot less sex than we had at their age, um, and also that um, some of the kind of sexual trends that I'm hearing about feel very disturbing to me, like choking and ejaculating in people's eyes and things like that. Um, so, how true are the rumors that I'm hearing about Gen Z? Um, how much sex are they having, and has the kind of sex they're having changed as far as you can tell?
Yeah, it does seem to be the case that they're having much less sex. And when we look at some of these representative data sets that have been like, oh, this many men and women are not having sex between 18 and 30. And then you break it down by age. Yeah, it's like the people that are 18 to 22, 18 to 23 that account for all of that. So that's kind of what we're seeing, with Generation Z here is that they're postponing adolescence, they're extending it, or I should say, they're extending adolescence. And part of that means that they're having sex much later in life. They're engaging in, adult behaviors that would lead to sex later in life as well. So they're getting jobs later. They're not moving out of the house. They're not getting driver's licenses. All of that's going to contribute. As you said, they spend a lot of time online. So a lot of their social interactions are mediated by being online. They're much less likely to use drugs or alcohol, which can account for, there's a couple of recent papers on that. This alone can account for about 20 to 30% of the variance in not having sex. Because, that's something people would do. They would go to parties, they would drink, they would have sex. You go to a bar, you're meeting people in real life, so you're drinking. So if you're not doing any of that, all of these things kind of come together to make it where they're much, much more likely, or less likely, I should say, to be having sex. Usually by the time 25 or something, it kind of balances out. We're seeing people get into relationships still, fortunately, and all of that. So it's probably not the case that like this is some big shift, like, oh, it's broken forever. They just seem to be remaining young longer. And, even just anecdotally, it almost seems like looking at them, they seem younger than people back in the day. But I don't know. As far as sexual behaviors and that, like, is that different? Are they engaging in more extreme sexual practice? I don't know about any data on that, except there was a really good paper actually on choking that indicated, yeah, it's pretty common. Experiences with that kind of vary a little bit. As to what that even means. For some people, choking is just like lightly holding the neck. Other people, it's like choking until they pass out. There's a lot, and those are probably things that kind of filter down through memes and porn and through the media and all of that. But I'm not sure to what extent that more extreme sexual practices are taking place. I would be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if that didn't turn out to be true. If we're talking about people who typically are not having sex to begin with in the first place.
Mm, mm, mm. Yeah, yeah. There seems to be a contradiction there. If you're not having sex until you're older, then maybe you're a bit more mature, so you can ask about things before doing them. So you're less likely to find yourself suddenly choked or
Yeah,
etc.
yeah.
Yeah. Do you have some advice for people? Dating advice?
Well, sure. So, one of the big things that I found across one of the surveys I ran that got a lot of attention was a lot of men are not approaching women in person. And this is not just like cold approach, what they call where you're like approaching a stranger, but like in
Oh,
any environment.
this I was going to ask. That's what I was going to ask actually, which is one of the black pill tropes is that you you just can't approach and a women anymore because you're likely to be accused of sexual harassment or even assault. So therefore, it's just wisest to avoid. Is there any kind of truth in that? Did Me Too change the culture in some ways that have handicapped people in dating, in your opinion? If so, was that a lasting effect? And yeah, that was my
Well,
question.
yeah, it probably did to some extent because now we have men citing it and saying, I'm not approaching because of this. But I'm not entirely sure to what extent that really made them afraid or to what extent these men were kind of timid to begin with. Because I asked,
Mm.
in that survey, like, why do you not approach? What are the big reasons? And the largest reasons were like, I'm afraid of social consequences, I'm afraid of rejection. And then like legal consequences were a little bit down further. So it's kind of like, okay, anything can happen. And we do occasionally see, in news reports and all of that, like, a guy approaches a woman and then he gets kicked off college campus or whatever because he asked her for a date. And then those stories go viral. They make it into memes. And that's how people form a lot of beliefs is from these very salient anecdotes. They're not like looking at the
Yeah,
data. But,
yeah,
one thing I learned from that survey is the men that are not approaching women at all are higher in risk aversion. They're less likely to take risks. So they're going to be men who are a little bit more afraid and that sort of a thing. And at the same time, a large majority of women said that they would like to be asked for dates more in person. So this wasn't just approaching strangers for dates, but this was like, you have a girl that you like that's in a hobby with you. Are you asking her for a date? Like a classmate that you know. So these are kind of appropriate situations. But yeah, I mean, rejection has always been terrifying for men. Asking a woman on a date or
yeah.
telling her you like her, it's always been one of the hardest things that you can do That wasn't different when we were young. It wasn't different. It's no different for them now. Now they have maybe excuses where they can be like, "Oh, I'm not doing it because of me too." And it's like the real reason you're not doing it is because you're afraid of rejection. It was already
Ugh.
terrifying. Now you have, a rationalization for why it's scary, but it was scary no matter what. And at the end of the day, here's the thing: if you don't ask a woman for a date, you're not going to get a date. She's never going to know that you like her. She's probably not going to ask you. Occasionally it happens, but and so that's what it comes down to. It's kind of like do or die in that sense. You can do it or not, and it is what it is.
Mm, mm, mm. So yeah, I interrupted you with the question, but uh, advice for people, men, women, young, old, based on the data that you've amassed, what are some strategies that work well, and some things that people may be discounting or
Sure. So
doing wrong
yeah,
or not realizing?
I think one, yeah, which was kind of the segue into that was, yeah, you have to ask people for dates. If people are just isolated and just kind of waiting, that's something that men need to get over. They need to get into, environments where they're meeting a lot of women, like dancing is a good one, building, having social interactions in these kind of environments, and then, being able to actually ask women for dates. That's the only way it's going to happen, especially if they're not getting a lot of matches on dating apps. Dating apps are a whole other game. They work for some men, they don't. I think right now in dating and all of that discourse, there's a lot of hostility. Men are kind of hostile and cynical about women. Women are hostile and cynical about men. Men and women need to get over that, because if you enter a relationship with those attitudes, you can't go into a relationship with
Mm.
negative opinions about like the class the other person belongs to. Like, I want to date a women, but also I kind of hate women. Like, that's not going to work. I want to date men, but I hate men. It's not going to work.
Well, imagine if it were some other group. If you said, I hate black people and I'm going to date black women or something.
Yeah,
Everybody would recognize
yeah,
immediately that that is a non-starter.
right,
The
yeah,
problem is
yeah.
your attitude. Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah,
go
exactly.
ahead.
Yeah, if you're, if you're dating someone and you already are starting with a mental template where they have a bunch of bad stuff about them and they're going to cheat on you or abuse you or whatever, it's like, yeah, you're not headed in a good direction there. And then I think maybe another thing is like, across all the research on attractiveness, what makes people more attractive? It's basically very conventional beauty standards. So I think we have a lot of beauty trends now that are kind of like trying to reject conventional beauty standards. Perhaps this applies a little bit more to women, where women are like, I don't want to do all of these conventional beauty standards, like, fat acceptance, not, alternative beauty trends, the nose piercings, short hair, dyed hair, not shaving body hair. And it's like all of these things are less attractive to men. What men like is very conventional on average. And the same is kind of true for women. Women prefer men that are more conventionally masculine on average. So men need to, lift, engage in masculine pursuits and all of that. Women need to kind of do that. And, you know, people, kind of get into debates on that. And it's kind of like, well, is this because of patriarchy creating these standards? So for me personally, I don't look into stuff like that. I don't care. I'm, an attractiveness guy. Attractiveness is my interest. So I'm saying, what makes men and women more attractive? Well, men like conventional feminine beauty standards. Women like conventional masculine beauty standards on average. And
Mhm.
important on that too, women who are more feminine, they prefer more masculine men. Men who are more masculine, they prefer more feminine women. There's a pretty good correlation in a recent study that I ran on that,
Oh,
about point 0.4 back
it's
and forth for
interesting.
both. So it's kind of like, yeah, especially if you are someone with those preferences, then you need to be kind of the preferences that the other person wants as well.
Ah, that's really interesting. So people who are more androgynous in the middle, are they more attracted to each other?
I bet they are. I would imagine that they are, and we kind of see that just anecdotally in life, don't we?
In
That those are the
I
kind of people that kind
yes,
of pair
yeah.
up. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, so many couples that I know look like brother and sister.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Well,
yeah,
that's a really
it's very
robust effect
striking.
too. Is familiarities that people pick partners who look physically like them or like their parents. So yeah, that's
Mm,
kind of another interesting thing there. Yeah,
yeah. I know you discussed this with Razib Khan. I listened to your absolutely hilarious interview with Razib recently. Um, and I know you didn't have an answer to that there, so I'm kind of just bringing it up because I feel it's an elephant, literally, literally an elephant in the room, which needs to be brought up. Which I'm surprised that there hasn't been a drop off in the number of people having sex and getting into relationships, because we've all got so much fatter. So, socially, a larger proportion of people have become less attractive, less sexually attractive. Both men and women, I think, especially women, have gained weight, um, and it's surprising and maybe heartening that that doesn't seem to have had an impact.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've looked into that. Like, are individuals who are overweight less likely to be in relationships? Are they less likely to be having sex? There's some relationship with, being overweight or obese and lower relationship satisfaction. But it's somehow it doesn't actually seem to stop people getting into relationships. Part of that might be because, I ran just a little poll on Twitter the other day and I asked, like, people that are overweight in relationships together, were you like that ahead of time or did you get like that after? Most of them got like that after. So that could be part of why it explains it. But also, it's kind of like, if you're a little overweight, maybe you're going to be a little more compromising or something like that. But I don't see how it, there's probably something missing if that's the only thing I'm looking at. It's like, are they more likely to be in relationships or not? And it's like, no, they're still getting in relationships. Great. But how can, we know, for example, that being overweight is substantially less attractive to most people across the board, despite the body positivity, fat acceptance, or whatever. We know
Mm.
this is a really robust effect. Is that obese bodies, even what it does to the face, is less attractive. So, given that, I can't imagine how having half of the population being overweight or anything like that does not impact the broader dating pool. I'll have to figure out some other
Great.
way to kind of
Mm.
look at that, but there's got to be some kind of
Yeah.
effect there.
I'd like to know whether couples are having less sex with each other, because they're both fat, for example.
Right? Yeah.
Um, and although they are committed to each other, let's say love each other and have connection, nevertheless they just don't get it on that often because they're just not as erotically stimulated. Um, I wonder, yeah.
Yeah, I would
Um,
imagine. So, I
mm,
mean, yeah, there are relationships with obesity and being overweight and lower sexual satisfaction and lower relationship satisfaction as well. So something is going on there, and even anecdotally, you can see that in people's accounts. They'll be like, my husband gained a lot of weight. We're not having sex as much. My wife gained a lot of weight. I'm not attracted to her. Yeah, it's a thing.
yeah, there's a little jingle at one point on NPR in the States, and um, I can't remember the whole of it. It was kind of a Minnesota couple, but I remember that some of the lines were, "Now we both weigh so much, it's gotten harder to touch and easier just to eat candy." Which must be the
Yeah,
case for many, many, many people.
yeah, yeah. That's their life now. Yeah, just candy, no touching.
um, yeah. So, uh, what do you think the best strategies would be if I said, I'm a single woman, age, say, let's take 35, which is a kind of median age. What is the best way for me to the what is the best way for me to find both a boyfriend and a boyfriend who will be long term, um, faithful, loyal, and to have a happy and good relationship? And what's the same thing that you would say to a man? The
Certainly.
equivalent thing
So,
you would say to a man?
yeah, I think, given the modern dating environment, especially with apps and stuff like that, I think women and men both at that age at 35 need to prioritize their physical appearance. If that means getting a makeover, start going to the gym and all of that. So yeah, the very basic kind of first steps there is like make yourself look as good as you can physically, get that out of the way. And then after that, it's all about partner selection at that point. And it's also, we know that people select assorted to lead for personality traits and all of that. So to some extent, it's about being the kind of person that you want to be with. Do you have those kinds of hobbies? Do you have those kinds of behaviors and actions and that sort of a thing? So if someone is, pursuing kind of a wild party life, high promiscuity, that's going to be the kind of people they come into contact with and the kind of behaviors they want to, or the kind of behaviors they end up with in the other person. So, finding people who have congruent values and all of that, who are oriented toward long-term relationships. And I mean, a good way to do that from the outset is to ask people, like, what are you looking for in the long run? What kind of person are you essentially, and that sort of a thing. Finding people who share hobbies. And I think if people have like good pro-social hobbies, like dancing is a very good one, for example. If you can find people that you share things in common with, I think that can help people form a bond that might not exist just for more superficial things, like I like the way that they look or whatever.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Um, is there anything I haven't asked you that I really should have asked you, or that you have a
Hmm.
lot of expertise on that I haven't given you a chance to hold forth upon?
I don't think so. I can't think of any. I think we covered some of the big ones, like the dating deal, like the risk aversion and not approaching. Yeah, I mean, those are the interesting ones for last year, I think, that really came
Mm,
up.
mm. Yeah. Do you have any intuitions about the future changes in dating um, patterns?
I think there's a lot of a skepticism about promiscuity now, in a sense. Perhaps people are less open toward it now than they were, despite kind of the promiscuity narratives, like, oh, people are being so promiscuous. I think what that's really done is, first off, people haven't been. They've been a little bit less, and then also people are forming really negative attitudes toward promiscuity, which maybe wasn't the case in the '90s or the early 2000s when people were being a little bit more promiscuous. It was very in vogue just to be like, yeah, like sexual liberation in a sense. So I'm wondering if in the future, if we're going to see people kind of shift more toward kind of traditional mindsets and all of that, perhaps more orientation toward monogamy, more skepticism of promiscuity and all of that. I think we're seeing really negative attitudes toward dating apps. So I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see other things come. I think people are still going to use them because it's like they're there. You kind of have to. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see movement towards um, some alternative. I don't know if people are going to start meeting more in person because they just live online now, but perhaps alternative apps that are not just like Tinder style dating apps, but matchmaking apps and that kind of thing, perhaps.
That would be good. I really ought to have ended with that question, which is future oriented, but I do have one more question actually, which something we haven't mentioned, which is polyamory
Oh, yeah.
and what some people are calling ethical non-monogamy. What are your feelings about that?
Sure. So only recently are we start to see some good research on polyamory, looking into that more. In some of the surveys that we did, we found, for example, that individuals who are polyamorous tend to express lower jealousy, and they also tend to actually have a higher secure attachment. So, for some individuals, polyamory might be something that they're able to do, but at the same time, human beings seem to have evolved a really strong tendency to pair bond, and part of that is jealousy and mate guarding, all of these things. So, for a lot of people, even I think if they think that polyamory is something that they might want to do on paper that looks good to them, when it comes down to the practice, they might really, really struggle with certain aspects of it, even if they're trying to learn to do it or it seems like a good idea, because we have emotions and we have cognitions. And sometimes we want to be a certain way, but it's really, really difficult to kind of fight those emotions and things that come up. So I think a lot of people are going to experiment with it. They're going to try it and maybe find out that it doesn't work for them. And certainly within polyamory communities, we see, that jealousy and dealing with those sorts of things is still something that a lot of people have to contend with. So in that sense, it might also be something, particularly for people that are perhaps higher in emotional intelligence or something like that. People that are able to kind of grapple with that and come to solutions. But I'm not sure to what extent it's ever going to be kind of a viable relationship pattern for most people.
Mm. Thank you. Alex, it's been really fun having you here. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I had a great time with all of the questions and everything.
Me too. So please do check the show notes for details on where to find Alex and to find more details about his work. And if you're on Twitter, he is one of my favorite people to follow on Twitter as well. And thanks, Alex. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye bye.